now let me introduce Max. Today's book has been reviewed in several publications. Some were very hostile, some were very commanding, but it also say it created quite a bit of controversy. And Max is here to read and introduce that book. So please do welcome him. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. And you know, this is my first New York talk. I've been on book tour since October. I've been continuously on book tour since October, to the point where I wake up and I don't know where I am, and I have to sometimes wake up in a hotel and I look out the window to find out where I am, and then I still don't know where I am because I'm in Phoenix. And I found that you know, rational political thought and human decency exists in inverse proportion from New York and Washington, D.C., to the distance that you get. There are really some incredible people out there. Something's happening out there. This movement that's coalesced around the issue of Palestine is growing rapidly. It's become the social justice cause of our time. And I've been to every field house and outhouse and hen house. I haven't been to a whorehouse yet, around the country, and I get these huge crowds that are just fired up around this issue. And I think that you know, it gives me hope, in complete contrast to the kind of responses I've gotten online, including at liberal publications like The Nation from the winner of the International Spilkus competition, Eric Alterman, who has written he's written enough to produce a book of his own, the I Hate Max Blumenthal handbook about me. But it's not reflective of the opinion that you see on the ground, the grassroots organic opinion. And you know, my presence here, I think, is an organic phenomenon just based on my own experience, having gone on the Birthright Israel tour, which they say will create a lifelong connection between you and Israel, which worked on me. It just didn't work in the way they wanted. And what's really happening on the ground, the reality on the ground. I can tell you, you know, my heroes are the students who are active on this issue, Students for Justice in Palestine. I was just on a speaking tour in Florida, and I went to every major school in Florida except University of Miami and Little Tel Aviv, also known as Miami. And you know, I met the students at Florida Atlantic University, and they have been sentenced to re-education seminars led by the Anti-Defamation League for protesting Colonel Benzie Gruber, who designed the rules of engagement for Operation Cast Lead, who is involved in crimes against humanity. And all they did was stage a silent walkout on this colonel, and they were sentenced to tolerance training by the Anti-Defamation League. I went to Florida International, where the students told me that they found listening devices placed in the Muslim prayer room. I went to Northeastern University, north of here in the frozen tundras of Boston, where the students have been forced to sign a civility statement because they staged a walkout on an Israeli soldier. And now I'm back in New York, and you know, the New York State Assembly has just passed legislation penalizing the American Studies Association for this resolution supporting BDS and the academic boycott. And so we see what's happening, we clearly see what's happening, which is this grassroots movement, which is rapidly growing, pushing for justice in Palestine, and the pro-Israel movement resorting to state power and calling on elites that it can pay off to crush this movement and to suppress this very discussion. And they have actually sought to suppress the discussion of my book by naming me, you know, putting me as number 9 on the Simon Wiesenthal Center's list of anti-Israel anti-Semites. They don't even call me self-hating anymore, because you know, it's too easy to say I am self-hating, but being Jewish has nothing to do with it. They call me an anti-Semitic Jew now. I was proud to be tied with Alice Walker as number 9 on the list, right behind European sports venues, those anti-Semitic concrete stadiums. And you know, as an American Jew, I really strive to be #1 in my field. So next year I'm hoping to replace Ayatollah Khamenei as #1 on the list. You have to laugh at it. You have to laugh, but you also have to kind of see the tragedy in their exploitation of anti-Semitism, because by exploiting it so thoroughly to suppress this discussion, they have sapped it of its discursive power and deprived it of all meaning, to the point that real anti-Semites who exist can wear anti-Semitism as a badge of honor. And that's the danger. Of course, Zionism and anti-Semitism continue to exist as two sides of the same coin. Of course, Israel continues to serve as the key catalyst for anti-Semitism in the world and its main beneficiary. And that is a theme in my book, which has played out in my life since I have released the book. And what we're seeing in this country, and what we're seeing in Israel, Palestine, which is the subject of the book, is sort of paradoxical. I mean, the rights of Jewish Israelis have never been more limited, to the point where they are starting to warn of fascism, and where they are starting to experience a scintilla of the kind of oppression that Palestinians have witnessed and experienced since 1948, while this discussion is opening in the United States. And it's a direct result of the fact that people in Israel are starting to realize that their country never was a democracy, that it always was an ethnocracy, and that they are witnessing the logical progression of Zionism 65 years after statehood. And so my book begins really, it begins with Operation Cast Lead, which was the assault on the Gaza Strip in 2008, 2009, which galvanized my indignation and outrage and provoked me to write this book in the first place. But what we were seeing in Israel was a national election being carried out at that time, at the time that Israel was battering the Gaza Strip with drones, with F-16s, with tanks, with an invasion, leaving over 1,400 dead, including over 300 children who, according to Amnesty International, were mostly killed in their own homes. And we saw Israelis sitting on Parash Hill, as Americans did during the Battle of Manassas in the Civil War, watching the assault on the Gaza Strip. This hill, nicknamed the Hill of Shame by the journalists who had been kept out of the Gaza Strip by the Israeli General Press Office. And cheering on their troops. One woman was photographed, was filmed on camera by a Danish news crew declaring that they should wipe the whole thing off the map. I'm a little bit fascist. And this opinion was consistent with the mainstream opinion in Jewish Israeli society, where 95% of Israelis supported the attack, where even the Meretz party, the most left-wing party in the Zionist spectrum, endorsed the attack, where Tzipi Livni, who is the current peace negotiator for the current Israeli government, said, "Our troops behaved like hooligans in the Gaza Strip, which I demanded of them." She was campaigning for prime minister, and this was how you campaign for prime minister. You try to translate blood into votes. Ehud Barak, who is the head of the Labor Party, said, "I would whack a terrorist on the toilet." And he was directly channeling Vladimir Putin, who said the same thing about his scorched earth campaign in Chechnya. This was Barak's attempt to appeal to the Russian vote. Of course, Avigdor Lieberman, the former bouncer from Moldova, who was also a former baggage handler at Ben Gurion International Airport, was the key beneficiary of the assault on the Gaza Strip, and the champion of the Russian-Israeli public. Lieberman was the third largest vote getter in the national elections and became the foreign minister, a top diplomat. He's still the foreign minister today and one of the leading politicians in Israeli society. And his success was predicated on a very simple slogan, which formed the basis of his campaign commercials and propaganda throughout the country. No loyalty, no citizenship. This meant if you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel and you fail to declare loyalty to the Jewish state, not to Israel, to the Jewish state, you will be summarily stripped of your citizenship and you must pack your bundles and leave, as Lieberman said. That's the direct quote. And so I entered Israel-Palestine in my first extended reporting trip for this book in May 2009, and Lieberman had become, you know, the real factor in Israeli politics, but also this wasn't reported in the U.S. media. Lieberman's party, Yisrael Beitenu, swept high school mock elections. I mean, in landslide victories. Benjamin Netanyahu and the Likud party won among the general public, but the voice of the youth, the party that commanded the hearts and minds of the Israeli youth, was Yisrael Beitenu, the party that proposed openly transfer of Palestinian citizens of Israel. And as the Israeli Democracy Institute polls show every year, Israeli youth and their attitudes grow more and more racist, more nationalistic, and more bellicose with each passing year, to the point where well over 50% declare their refusal to sit in a classroom with an Arab citizen of Israel. Well over 50% declare their refusal to live next door to an Arab or a non-Jewish migrant. A plurality of Jewish Israelis, in fact, in 2011 in this poll, and this was the only time they've been asked this question, declared their support for detention camps for Arab citizens of Israel during times of war. When are times of war in Israel? Well, since the foundation of the State of Israel, it has been in a state of emergency, which governs everything from ice cream production to national security. And in the recent reauthorization of the state of emergency, Supreme Court Justice Eliakim Rubinstein justified it on the basis that Israel is a normal country that is not normal. That's the epigraph for my book. So I enter in this at the culmination of this transitional phase, when Israel has moved into a permanent right-wing majority. The logic of Zionism has really been fulfilled, and these bellicose figures who have promised to finish 48 as the source of their popularity have attained have attained the most power they have ever achieved in Israeli history. And I enter, of course, as many of you may have entered, through Ben Gurion International Airport. And so that's kind of where I enter the book, where I enter the narrative. Ben Gurion International Airport looks like any other airport in the world, but once you encounter security officials, whether they're private or they're from the Shin Bet, Israel's General Security Service, you start to understand the essential logic of the Jewish state, because you're assigned a number based on your ethnicity. These are the racial profiling experts who are training our airport security personnel, 1 through 6. And you know, if you are Palestinian or you're Lebanese, you'll get anywhere from 3 to 5, probably 5 or 6. Those are the highest threat levels. If you get 6, you're deported for 10 years, as Noor Judah recently was. She is the Palestinian-American teacher at the Quaker school in Ramallah, who was deported for 10 years and prevented from finishing her semester with her students for unknown reasons. And there are so many people like Noor who have had this experience. In fact, Israel deports over 100 Arab Americans every year, and the US government says nothing and does nothing for them. Noor had a USAID visa, and USAID was unable to do anything for her. Donna Shalala, this was the best, the best incident ever, who is the president of the University of Miami, was on her way to Israel to a conference of university presidents to discuss ways to fight Palestine solidarity activism on campus. And Donna Shalala was subjected to hours of humiliating interrogation because she is, of course, Lebanese American. She was flagged as, I think, a number 5. And then there are even Jewish Americans who have been deported as well, from Norman Finkelstein to the dangerous octogenarian Noam Chomsky. My friend Max Geller, who handles the Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at Northeastern, was, I think, stripped naked and held for 8 hours in a cell for his activism in the US. I'm hoping that I'll get to keep my clothes on my next trip there. But normally I get a 1 or a 2. And that's, because I'm asked, am I Jewish? Yes. Are my parents Jewish? Check. Yes. Are my grandparents Jewish? Yes. And then I'm waved through. And at one point I declared that I had a girlfriend in Tel Aviv I was going to see. This was false. And I was asked, are you thinking of getting married? And I said yes. And then the idea of me injecting top-grade Ashkenazi sperm into the ovum of a Jewish woman entered the mind of this security officer, offsetting the Arab demographic threat, and I was waved through an additional security check with a big smile. So you see the whole logic there at the airport. And I understood this also on a personal level, that as a Jewish American, I was going to have access that someone who is just as talented or more talented as me, who was Palestinian or Arab, could not get. And that was a burden that I took with me throughout this book, that I had this privilege and I had to take full advantage of it. Every time I go to Ramallah, and my friends who I made friends with in New York ask me, can you sneak me in to take me to the beach? When they ask me that, I'm reminded of that privilege, because I really have no connection to that place. I have no familial or ancestral connection to that place, except that according to the logic of the Jewish state, at some point in my history, I was hanging out, my ancestors were hanging out with Methuselah and Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and kicking it with Abraham and Sarah and Hebron. My grandfather is from the west side of Chicago, and that's all I know. So I wanted to take advantage of this. I wanted to immerse myself in the key institutions of Israeli society. And one of the major institutions that I wanted access to is the Knesset. This was pretty easy for me to do. I had a friend, David Sheen, who's actually going to be coming here next month. And I'll talk about him in a minute. He was doing translation for Haaretz, which is the liberal newspaper in Israel. It's the voice of the enlightened public. And he had a Haaretz email address. And I said, David, email all of these Knesset members and ask them for interviews. And they thought they were going to get promotion. And one of the ways that the members of the Knesset, after 2009, who were elected, wanted to promote themselves was by introducing racist and anti-democratic laws. It was almost as though there was a competition for who could introduce the most racist law between these figures. And of course, Lieberman's party, Yisrael Beitenu, was leading the pack. And they had a very easy time of passing these laws, at least in diluted form, because the centrist party at the time, Kadima, and the supposedly liberal party, Labor, which has never been liberal, and even Meretz, would stand out of the way and either abstain to vote on these laws or co-sponsor the laws. Ehud Barak and the Labor Party were the co-sponsor of the loyalty oath, fulfilling Avigdor Lieberman's promise to strip Palestinian citizens of Israel of their rights. It was an amendment to the Israeli citizenship law demanding that any new citizen take a loyalty oath declaring that they were loyal to the Jewish and democratic state. And one of the supporters of this law from the Likud party, Ofer Akunis, went on Israeli national news on Channel 2 and defended it by declaring Joseph McCarthy was right in every word he said when someone challenged him on this law being McCarthyite. But there were other laws punishing NGOs, including mainstream Israeli NGOs like B'Tselem and the New Israel Fund, attempting to deprive them of foreign funding, the acceptance to community law, justifying and legitimizing discrimination on the basis of race and religion for communities of under 500. A law has just been introduced to raise the electoral threshold to prevent Arab parties from being able to enter the Knesset. It would raise it to 4 seats because most Arab parties hold 2 to 3 seats. There was the anti-incitement law introduced by the Jewish Home Party, which called for prison terms of up to 2 years for anyone who convinced another Israeli citizen to become disloyal. And when I asked the author of the law why he introduced it, he said it was in order to place Hanin Zouabi of the Balad Party in jail and to ban the Balad Party. The Balad Party, of course, was founded by Azmi Bishara, who has been exiled from Israel, falsely accused, in my opinion, of being a spy for Hezbollah, and his real crime was to organize for Israel as a state of all its citizens without racial or religious preferences. And so Hanin Zouabi is carrying the mantle of Bishara, and she is now the most hated woman in Israel. Her colleague in the Balad Party, Jamal Zahalka, told me that he had a bet with a friend, an ongoing bet, that if one of these anti-democratic laws was not introduced one week, he would throw a huge party and he would buy the lamb. And he said, so far I haven't had to buy the lamb. Every week there's a new law like this, so much so that I can't keep track of them. A law was recently reintroduced by the Jewish Home Party, the third largest party in Netanyahu's governing coalition, declaring Israel's Jewish character to be superior to its democratic charter, bringing apartheid into the open, and stripping Arabic as an official language of the state. So the day will come, I believe, when parties representing the Palestinian citizens of Israel are banned from the Knesset. The Central Elections Committee has twice voted to ban Hanin Zouabi and the Balad Party from the Knesset, each time overturned by the Supreme Court. And in response, the Knesset has introduced laws to strip the Supreme Court of its power, allowing a legislative veto of the Supreme Court's rulings. I interviewed David Rotem, who is a top figure in Avigdor Lieberman's party, who is the head of the Constitution Committee, which is such an important committee in a country that has no constitution and is basically making it up as it goes along, because he basically gets to write the rules and bang the gavel whenever, kind of in an ad hoc fashion. And Rotem told me straight up, looked me in the eyes, and he said, the tyranny of the majority is the essence of democracy. That is really the defining mentality of the Knesset today. And so all these parties, all the mainstream parties and the right-wing parties galvanized around a single law, which I think is a seminal law that we can commonly refer to it as the Nakba law. And it was a law punishing observance of the Palestinian Nakba in 1948, when 750,000 indigenous Palestinians were expelled and ethnically cleansed to allow the foundation of a Jewish state. It would, in its original wording, the law would have meted out 2-year prison terms to anyone who participated inside, any citizen of Israel who participated in observances of the Palestinian Nakba. And the law passed. The centrist parties generally supported it. Labor abstained. And the right-wing parties, who are the real, who've captured the hearts and minds of Israeli society, voted for it. The law was sponsored and introduced by someone named Alex Miller, who I interview in Goliath, who is 28 years old and spent most of his life, or much of his life, in Moscow, and whose Hebrew was not as good as Hanin Zouabi's Hebrew, or Ahmed Tibi's Hebrew, or any of the Palestinian legislators, who did not understand anything about the Palestinians and who came to Israel without any understanding that there were Palestinians there. But as Avigdor Lieberman's deputy, he came to understand that these Arabs inside the state were not only a demographic contaminant, but a fifth column and a Trojan horse for Arab nationalism and Islamism. And he attempted to relate to me in this interview. And he said, you wouldn't allow the burning of the American flag in the US. And I said, well, actually, it is still technically legal. And I quoted back to him Frederick Douglass's writing, his essay on July 4th, when Frederick Douglass declared that he could never observe July 4th or celebrate the foundation of the United States as long as slavery was legal. So that pretty much ended our interview. Most of my interviews kind of ended with these uncomfortable pauses and kind of, unfortunate dismissals from the office. But here you see what's happening. You see in the laws being passed in the Knesset a legislative form of settler colonialism, with recent immigrants to the land seeking to replace the indigenous population and to fulfill their promise to the Israeli public to finish 1948. There's a book out right now that is, I think, kind of been deployed in place of my book by much of the liberal Jewish establishment, called My Promised Land, by a writer named Ari Shavit. And this book has been discussed on Charlie Rose by David Remnick and Jeffrey Goldberg. David Remnick hosted a party for Ari Shavit, and top Israeli celebrities were actually flown in for the party. David Brooks praised the book. I guess he wasn't, he has no excuse. He wasn't, induced by THC to do this. Who else? Thomas Friedman praised the book heavily. It's been heavily promoted. And Shavit makes a point in the book that I make in my book because of my understanding of the Nakba in Israeli life. Because I understand that Jewish Israelis are deeply threatened by the mere discussion of the Nakba. Limor Livnat, who is a former minister in Netanyahu's government, said that the teaching of the Nakba encourages disloyalty. And I understand the Nakba as the ultimate source of Palestinian grievances, that it's not about 67, it really is about 1948. And Ari Shavit, who is this liberal Zionist Israeli journalist and essayist, comes forward and says, yes, it's true. It's all about 1948. Not only that, but he discusses the ethnic cleansing of Lida, which is now known as Lod, where tens of thousands of Palestinians were sent on the Lida death march to Ramallah in very stark terms. I mean, he gets some facts wrong, and my discussion of it is, of course, more graphic, and I present the crimes, I think, in a more complete fashion. But it's important that he acknowledges this as his pivotal period. But Shavit goes forward, and then he diverges from where I go, because I think 1948 was a crime that needs to be prosecuted and reversed, just like any act of ethnic cleansing should be. But Shavit declares that it needs to be consolidated, because without the Nakba, he says he could not have been born, and Israel could not have existed as a Jewish state. Well, somebody had to say it. Benny Morris had already said this in much more, explicit terms, in a crude way. But Shavit said it, and he became the toast of the town in New York and in Washington, D.C., among the liberal Jewish establishment, which wouldn't even discuss my book. I mean, I met with Remnick and gave him my book, and he hasn't done anything with it. And he knows what's going on. But what I think Shavit doesn't understand or refuses to acknowledge in my book, which I do in my book, and which the right wing in Israel understands, is that 1948 is a continuous process, an ongoing process, and that every day for Palestinians is 1948. As Ilan Pape recently said on a panel with me in Chicago, there hasn't been a day in the state of Israel, in the history of Israel, without some form of ethnic cleansing occurring before our eyes. And that was my experience. It was my experience just living in Jaffa, just 5 minutes south of Tel Aviv, and witnessing Palestinians in my neighborhood being slapped with eviction orders simply for renovating their kitchens, because it's impossible to get a building permit if 40% of your house was placed in state hands in 1948, and as a Palestinian, you're not able to build because your natural growth is intentionally limited, so you will eventually leave. I understood it going 15 minutes east to Lod, to this site of ethnic cleansing, to the Abu Aid neighborhood, a group of families, and I arrive in the neighborhood and the whole thing has been reduced to rubble. It looks like a scene in Gaza after Operation Cast Lead. And all that this family had done, these 10 families who occupied several city blocks, was attempt to build their homes according to the natural growth of their families without permits that they could not attain. And so the children were forced to do their homework in tents in the rainy season, and to keep warm they stood around open fires in the middle of Israel, in the middle of Lod, as Israeli citizens. And they said to me, as so many have said to me, across Palestine, across Israel, the days of 48 have come again. I understood this when the residents of Andromeda Hills in Jaffa, a new gated community built for Jews in the Palestinian ghetto of Jaffa, in Ajami, began filing noise complaints against the call of the muezzin from mosques that predated the state of Israel, and against the St. George's Church, the tolling of the bells from this church, which was a deliberate act in order to make life so unpleasant for non-Jews that they would leave this area. Endorsed by Netanyahu, who said, we don't need to be more liberal than Europe, declaring his affinity for the European xenophobes and neo-fascists who are attempting to do the same things to keep immigrants out. But in this case, Netanyahu was attempting to remove indigenous people who were already there. I noticed 1948 is a continuous process when my favorite fish restaurant in Jaffa, owned by Palestinian Christians, was firebombed by hoodlums from the hills of Hebron, by right-wing Jewish settlers, and by those same settlers who vandalized the local Muslim cemetery in Jaffa, who attacked local residents in Jaffa, and who staged Jaffa for Jews marches each week through the center of Yefet Street. I noticed it also when I saw border police setting up flying checkpoints in Jaffa, far from the Green Line, on a search for quote-unquote infiltrators, who are Palestinians who may have slipped in to find work. And finally, I noticed it in the Negev desert when I arrived at Al-Araqib one night, an unrecognized Bedouin village, and woke up to the sound of bulldozers wiping the village off the map, and watched children sitting on their beds in the open desert as their homes were crumpled to pieces, and saw activists tossed away like empty crates, and saw the village water tank towed away by an Israeli riot squad, which left the residents to rebuild the village for the third time with the Jewish Israeli activists who had come to attempt to defend them. And that village has been rebuilt 51 times, and each time it's been destroyed by these bulldozers, which are emblazoned with the logo of the Jewish National Fund, a 501c3 nonprofit in the United States, which raises tens of millions of dollars in the US and pays hundreds of thousands of dollars to people like Prime Minister Stephen Harper and ex-President Bill Clinton to speak at their galas. I remember as a kid in Hebrew school, I donated a little bit of money to the Jewish National Fund to plant a tree in Israel in the name of my pet dog who had been run over by a car. I don't know where that tree is, but it probably sits on the land of some Palestinian village which had been ethnically cleansed. The three villages of Yalu, Beit Nuba, and Imwas, which is Emmaus in the Old Testament, are now Canada Park, where Israelis celebrate their Independence Day. So is it any wonder that Palestinians on Independence Day will come out and observe their tragedy? Well, it's considered a threat because it is a obstruction to finishing 48. Now, as I said before, the right wing understands correctly that 1948 is a continuous process. The left wing of the Zionist spectrum sees 1948 as something that had been done and that Palestinians need to get over it. Just get over it, as Thomas Friedman said in the New York Times. Ari Shavit in Guernica, the left-wing magazine, recently said Palestinians are addicted to victimhood. That this is all in the past, and let's let bygones be bygones and get over it. You know, and I understood the mentality of these kind of, you can call them liberal Zionists, the Zionist left, the kibbutzim. When I visited Ein Hod, which is an artist's village in northern Israel, it's northeast of Haifa. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the country. And I arrived in this artist colony and walked in, and there's this weird sculpture of a nude couple inside a sardine can. I still don't know what it means. And a tour guide, I followed a tour guide in. She's leading a group of Israelis speaking in Hebrew through these stone homes, which have become art studios. One of them was the art studio of Marcel Janco, who is a Romanian Dadaist, who basically, quote-unquote, founded this village in 1952. And I saw this kind of these shtetl scenes, this Judaica kind of kitsch art inside these stone homes. And the tour guide was telling people, these are third-generation homes. And I said, these don't look like third-generation homes. Like, I lived in a third-generation home, and it was like a subdivision in Southern California. It wasn't, you know, this rustic. You know, and in the town there is a restaurant and a bar. There's you can drink homebrewed beer in the bar. And it kind of occurred to me that this might have been a Palestinian place once. So I went 3 miles up the road, 3 kilometers up the road, after the host kind of dismissed my questions about who lived in these homes more than 3 generations ago, and told me that there are no facts, there are only narratives, in this kind of cold post-structuralist language. And so I went 3 kilometers up the road to the other Ein Hod, which is just spelled slightly differently. And it was a Palestinian Einhod, which had been an unrecognized village till 2006. And there I met the former residents of what is now the Jewish Einhod, who are now not allowed to return to their homes, which are now art studios, and have to basically seethe with resentment just up the road because of the absentee property law, which placed all property that was abandoned between the signature of the ratification of the UN partition plan in 1947 and the cessation of hostilities in 1948 in the hands of the state of Israel. So they were just legally barred from returning to their homes. And I learned that the bar and restaurant used to be the village mosque. And I learned that the Mukhtar's house was now Marcel Janco's museum. Just as the village Mukhtar's house of Sheikh Mohannis is the faculty lounge at Tel Aviv University. And I went back to Ein Hod, the Jewish place, to ask questions, and I went to the bar and I met a chatty woman from a kibbutz down the road and presented these facts to her, and she looked at me and shrugged and she said, well, this is the whole story of Israel. It's all built on top of Palestine. I mean, what do you want? And I said, yeah, I guess that's true. I can't really argue with you. And she said, well, you know, I think we should let bygones be bygones. And I said, well, can you say that in the original German? And you know, we Palestinians cannot let bygones be bygones. I spend so much time in my book just talking about the situation of 48 Palestinians and how they are facing this process of expulsion. I mean, in the Negev desert, there was the Prover Plan, which was an extension of what I saw in Al-Araqib to remove 40 to 70,000 indigenous Bedouins from these unrecognized villages, which can't be recognized simply because they're not Jews, because they don't have J-positive blood, and being forced into Indian reservation-style communities, which represent the only Arab towns ever built by Israel since 1948. But it's not just there, it's in Haifa, among the very cosmopolitan, educated, English-speaking Palestinians who are my friends. They feel a pressure to leave. And I wrote about Fida Kiwan, who opened this cafe called Azad in Haifa, and how she was basically expelled from the town. Her cafe was shut down by the municipality because she refused to serve anyone in uniform. Then it was attacked by right-wing mobs. When I went to visit it, the windows were shattered. And you know, you see shattered windows of storefronts of businesses targeted because of the ethnicity of their owners, and you think of very dark events in history. And she told me, you know what, I'm sick and tired of trying to struggle to build some space for tolerance and coexistence in Israel. I'm going to move to Ramallah, where I'll be occupied, and everyone knows they're occupied because I'm occupied here. I'm occupied beneath fake layers of democracy, and at least I can be with the people who know that they're occupied where it's honest. So she essentially self-transferred. And that was those were comments that were emblematic in my interviews with a lot of young Palestinians in Haifa who are heavily educated and could have contributed so much to Israeli society if only they had been of a different ethnicity. We're being actively driven out. So the right wing understands that bygones can't be allowed to be bygones. They understand that that Israel is an ethnocracy, that Israel's existence as a Jewish state is predicated on a Jewish majority, and that to maintain a Jewish majority, you have to continually carry out demographic engineering, which can often be violent and is very much unpleasant. And they are willing to do so and to talk about their desire to do so openly. So is it any surprise that they should be the captains of the state, the most popular figures? Shouldn't be any surprise at all that someone younger than me, the Sarah Palin of Israel, Tzipi Hotovely, who speaks better English than Sarah Palin, is already the deputy transportation minister, which is a stepping stone to major national office, to a higher ministerial position. This is someone, Tzipi Hotovely, who has told Hanin Zouabi to her face on Israeli national TV that her goal is to remove all Arabs like her from the Knesset. Someone who has said that they want to annex the West Bank and do away with the fantasy of a Palestinian state. and give Palestinians Jordanian citizenship. Someone who has hosted members of Israel's burgeoning anti-miscegenation movement to testify in the Knesset on the dangers of assimilation. Is it any wonder that in this situation, 40% of the Israeli officer corps is now filled with religious nationalists, and that the Shin Bet is for the first time controlled by a religious nationalist director, or that the first religious nationalist from the settlements is on the Supreme Court? Is it any wonder that a book called Torat HaMelech sold more copies in Israel than Peter Beinart's The Crisis of Zionism sold in the US? And what is Torat HaMelech? It is, according to Ma'ariv, the Israeli newspaper, a manual for when it is permissible to kill non-Jews. It is a manual for genocide that has been distributed by the thousands into the Israeli officer corps, and which was held up by hundreds of members of the Shimshon Brigade, one of the most violent units operating in the West Bank, at a protest in the Western Wall against evacuating settlement outposts. Among the book's lowlights is a passage declaring that it is permissible to kill non-Jewish babies, Gentile babies, if it has been deemed that they will grow up to harm us. The book was written by Yitzhak Shapira and Yitzhak Ginsburg, two rabbis from the settlement of Yitzhar near Nablus, whose yeshiva has been funded by a 501c3 nonprofit called the Central Fund of Israel, which exists right here on Fifth Ave inside the offices of the Marcus Brothers Textiles Company, and which has not been regulated by the Treasury Department. From Yitzhar, rockets have been fired into Nablus, homemade rockets. You never hear about this. In any case, I went to a conference at the Ramada Jerusalem Hotel to defend Torat HaMelech's publication against criticism. And there I found some of the most prominent rabbis, state-funded rabbis in the state of Israel, some of the key religious figures on a stage to declare their support for this book and their opposition to any attempts to ban its publication. And in order to mix into the crowd, because press like me, secular press, was not necessarily welcome there, I wore a kippah, and I walk in and I start mixing with the crowd, which is praying, and I realize that maybe it's a good idea if I start praying. And so I have to stand there and start davening with these religious nationalists, and I realize I'm saying the Kaddish with them, which is the mourner's prayer that I said for my grandfather, and I said for my uncle, and that it always meant so much to me. And I'm standing with Dov Lior, who is the rabbi from the official rabbi from Kiryat Arba, who declared that Yitzhak Rabin was a rodef, or a traitor, and a moser, and a snitch, providing religious justification for his assassination, who called Baruch Goldstein, the man who slaughtered 29 Palestinians at the Cave of the Patriarchs, a gever, or a great man, and who was called for live human experimentation on Palestinian prisoners. And I'm davening alongside Baruch Marzel, who is a right-wing thug who conducts price tag attacks on Palestinians in Hebron and leads anti-miscegenation squads inside Israel. And I'm davening alongside Michael Ben-Ari, who is an Israeli legislator who told me in an interview that he will never say that Jordan is Palestine because Jordan is Israel. And I'm wondering about what religious nationalism and the current state of affairs in Israel is doing to Judaism, and how I can say the same prayer as these people, and what do I have in common with them? Do I have anything in common with them? Do I have to break away? Well, these thoughts constantly came to my mind conducting this book, and it's coming back here and coming to these events that I'm able to kind of put them to rest. In any case, this movement continued to expand its influence throughout the country. Two rabbis' letters were signed soon after Torat HaMelech's publication. One by hundreds of key religious authorities in Israel declaring that it is against Jewish law to rent apartments to non-Jews, and another by their wives declaring that it is against Jewish law for Jews to have relationships with non-Jews, specifically Arabs and non-Jewish African refugees. This letter inspired the anti-miscegenation movement that I've been discussing throughout this talk, movement led by a group called Lahava, which was formed out of the ashes of Meir Kahana's Kach party, which was actually banned in Israel. And Meir Kahana was kicked out of the Knesset in 1988 for racist incitement, but actually because he posed an electoral threat to Yitzhak Shamir's Likud party. Lahava has set up a hotline that allows anyone to inform on interreligious and interracial couples. It has handed out kosher certificates to businesses that declare their refusal to employ non-Jews. It has placed leaflets around Jerusalem warning Arab men that they can speak to Jewish women at their own peril. I've seen posters around Jerusalem containing photographs of Arab men who have supposedly made passes at Jewish women or had relationships with them or alleged to have relationships with them. It set up civil patrols that march up and down the beaches of Israel warning Jewish women not to speak to Arab men. Its sister group, Hemla, which runs a home for supposedly abused Jewish women, women who are abused in relationships with Arab men, has been funded by the State of Israel. It collects half of its budget from the State of Israel. And recently, the National Civil Service Administration declared that barred religious Jewish women from volunteering in hospitals after 9 p.m. for fear that they would date Arab doctors. Unusual decision to me as an American Jew who's been raised to believe that it is good to date doctors. This decision was endorsed by the economics minister Naftali Bennett, head of the third largest party, Bayit Yehudi, the Jewish Home Party. And these decisions and this movement has real consequences, consequences that I attempted to warn of when I released my Feeling the Hate in Jerusalem video, when I released countless videos and reports while I was staying in central Jerusalem about the atmosphere of racism in the area, incited by top-level officials. And there were, I thought, the most severe instance elucidating the danger of these movements and of this incitement was when 19-year-old Jamal Julani, Palestinian worker who had been passing through the area, was beaten into a coma by a mob of Jewish youth last year because the youth had been told by a 15-year-old girl that he had made a pass at her, which was completely false, turned out to be a lie, but reminded me of nothing more than the Emmett Till lynching in the United States, of a submerged history that had resurfaced in modern-day Israel, and illustrates to us the truth of William Faulkner's statement that the past is never dead, it isn't even past. At the courthouse, one of the perpetrators declared his only regret was that Julani had not been killed, and the 15-year-old girl admitted that she was a liar. Outside the courthouse was Benzi Gopstein, former lieutenant of Meir Kahana, now the head of the Lahava anti-miscegenation movement, who had testified in the Knesset at the behest of Tzipi Hotovely, the deputy transportation minister. And he declared that these youth who had beaten Julani had lifted Israel's national pride off the floor and done what the police had refused to do. These kind of attacks have quadrupled in the past year, according to the United Nations, and it's clear that the Israeli police and army and authorities have very little interest in stopping them. In the last week, Lahava subjected Benjamin Netanyahu to a withering attack because his son, Yair, who had actually on his Facebook page endorsed the rabbi's letter declaring it illegal to rent to non-Jews, was caught dating a non-Jewish Norwegian girl who he was going to college with. And Lahava said, this is an embarrassment. Netanyahu was attacked by the Shas party. He came under withering attack from officials in the Knesset. And so Netanyahu has come out yesterday with a statement claiming that his son was only a study buddy of this girl. They were just study partners. There is no relationship going on. He did not have sexual relations with that woman, depending on what your meaning of is. I don't know if he's asked SodaStream to create a J-positive blood filter for the girl or not, but this is really illustrative of a wider phenomenon in Israeli society, a phenomenon which was inspired at the inception of the State of Israel, and a phenomenon which is rooted in the idea of a Jewish state which is based on ethnic purity. And so we've seen throughout the history of the state attempts to cleanse the state of Palestinians under the guise of security concerns. This is always how it's justified in the US, and it's generally how it's justified by the Supreme Court in Israel. It's how the Israeli public understands it. But now they're facing a new demographic contaminant that has posed no security threat to the state whatsoever, which totally discredits, I think, the idea of liberal Zionism. And this is, of course, the 60,000 non-Jewish African refugees who for the past 3 weeks have staged a strike demanding their rights under the UN Convention on Refugees, which Israel has actually signed, and which Israel refuses to grant them. In fact, there's no path to asylum inside Israel for them. Now, these 60,000 refugees mostly come from Sudan. They mostly come from Darfur, and my book presents their story, I think, for the first time to the American public. It was largely a story that was ignored by the New York Times, but which is essential to understanding what's going on inside Israel today. They have fled Janjaweed in the Darfur region. And of course, the Israel lobby is heavily involved in the Free Darfur movement and has said absolutely nothing about these people. And they've arrived in Israel to find a new kind of Janjaweed, from the sort of figures who I've been talking about for the past half hour or so. The right wing in Israel has incited race riots in South Tel Aviv, where African businesses have had their storefront windows smashed. Africans have been attacked in the street on a regular basis. According to Rami Gudovich, an activist in South Tel Aviv, African children have feces thrown at them on their way to school. He said that he's seen things that make it hard for him to continue to go on and live as a human being. They've also been denied work permits, so they're forced to sleep openly in South Tel Aviv, one of the poorest areas in Israel, provoking massive conflict in the neighborhood. And so the state of Israel had created a crisis, of course. These people could not be assimilated because they're not Jews. And it had to intensify the crisis through its solution. And its solution was based on a pre-existing solution it had for Palestinians, rooted in the 1953 Anti-Infiltration Act, which was passed to illegalize the presence of the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who attempted to slip back in what became the borders of Israel, to reunite with their families, to reconnect with their land, to actually till the soil that had fallen fallow since their land had been expropriated by the state of Israel. And this act was amended to apply to non-Jewish Africans, to declare them all infiltrators, and to legalize their indefinite detention, to make it possible to detain them for anywhere from 1 to 3 years without charges. So currently, there are thousands of non-Jewish Africans sleeping in the Negev desert in shipping containers in the Holot detention camp. This detention camp is a revision of another camp which was a closed prison, and it's called an open accommodation center by the State of Israel. What does that mean? It means that they have to check in 3 times a day, and they can only work inside the center, but they are allowed to leave. Of course, there's nowhere to go because they're in the middle of the desert. And they have to sleep there at night, segregated from the Israeli public. That is when the prison closes. It closes at nightfall. And they must be segregated from the Israeli public at night for fear that they will assimilate. Many of them speak Hebrew. Most of them speak Hebrew. They have skills. They can work. I have a close friend in Tel Aviv who's been in a relationship with a man from Sudan, and she said, I can't call him my boyfriend or partner because the state is probably going to deport him, and when he goes back to the Sudan, he'll be killed, because he'll be seen as a traitor there. So we have no future. So this is the logic behind this camp, is preventing integration and assimilation. The camp is anachronistic in the Western world. It reminds me of the towns that existed throughout the United States, not just in the Deep South, but even in Chevy Chase, Maryland, where ordinances were put in place to bar the presence of African Americans after dark. The historian James Lowen wrote a book about these towns, and he called it Sundown Towns. With this anachronistic solution to a problem which is created by the maintenance of a Jewish state predicated on ethnic purity, Benjamin Netanyahu and his government have transformed Israel into the world's only sundown town, something that really is foreign in the modern world. They've created camps that resemble Manzanar, our camp in World War II, which existed for Japanese Americans who had been deemed to possess enemy race blood. And this is exactly the logic behind the internment of non-Jewish Africans in Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu has declared that they present a threat to the Jewish character of the state of Israel, and it goes to the very logic of a Jewish state and is really the foundation of the crisis that I portray in my book. And so I think it's incredible, if you watched the State of the Union last night, that Barack Obama is one of the first American presidents to emphasize Israel as a Jewish state, to refer to it as the Jewish state, and to demand that the Palestinian Authority recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Barack Obama, the product of the civil rights movement, the product of a multicultural society, is seeking to consolidate all of the trends that I just described through this demand, which I don't think George W. Bush made of the Palestinian Authority. Now, you have to recognize also that for the last half hour or so, I have not gone beyond the green line. Everything that I have discussed just now is occurring inside the green line, inside the part of Israel that will be legitimized by a two-state solution. Not only that, but John Kerry, in trying to lay out a framework agreement, or what he has called a framework for a framework, because it's obviously going nowhere, like two penguins attached from the back end, is being conducted on Netanyahu's terms. The Palestinian Authority is still sitting down to negotiate, and at the same time they're leaking out the details. Yasser Abed-Rabo just leaked the details to Al Hayat, and they're coming out slowly, including in the Israeli media. And here's what we're seeing. A new wall will be built on the Jordanian border, which, according to Israeli Army radio, this is the exact language that Israeli Army radio used, the Palestinians will be imprisoned between two walls. Of course, we already have the separation wall on the western border. Israeli troops will remain for the long term in the Jordan Valley. Moshe Ya'alon, the defense minister, has demanded that they be there for 50 years. Assuming Israel lasts that long, that's a pretty long time. John Kerry has called for early warning systems to be placed throughout the West Bank. What does that mean? That means spying systems in and around Palestinian population centers, a boon to the private surveillance industry in Israel and the United States. Israel has demanded and received permission from John Kerry to fly drones over the West Bank, which means that the West Bank will be transformed into a dystopic, Gazified panopticon. Israel will get the major settlement blocks. 80% of all settlements are in the major blocks, and they will be incorporated into a future state of Israel, including Ariel, which sits on top of the West Bank aquifer, which provides 85% of the Palestinian water supply and is currently off limits to Palestinians. And Netanyahu has additionally demanded Beit El, which is a far-flung settlement barely connected to the major settlement blocks, and Hebron, where the most fanatical Jewish settlements lie. Avraham Avinu is a settlement that exists in expropriated or stolen Palestinian apartments, and if you go below Avraham Avinu in Hebron, in the Palestinian market, you will have to walk beneath a steel net, because those settlers constantly drop bricks and eggs and feces and urine on the Palestinian shopkeepers. So they'll get to stay there in perpetuity. So the question is, what will be left for a Palestinian state, and what is possible politically for Netanyahu, even if he wanted to create a Palestinian state? Naftali Bennett has already threatened to pull out, the third largest party in the coalition, if Netanyahu withdraws one settler. Avigdor Lieberman has demanded the transfer of 250,000 Palestinians of Israel in the Arab Triangle near the Green Line in the north, redrawing the borders around them. And so it's clear that this two-state solution is not going to happen. The majority of Israelis have declared to the Israeli Democracy Institute that they want to find new allies in the Obama era. And I'm prepared to introduce a petition supporting them. Most have said, 70%, that they don't know where they'll find those allies, however, which suggests that they don't see any way out of the crisis that they're in. And Moshe Ya'alon and Avigdor Lieberman and Netanyahu have all declared their true goal is to maintain the situation, to maintain the occupation, and to manage it forever, which means they have no end game. I think Ariel Sharon, with his feeding tube and his coma, was the perfect symbol of Israel in its current state. And the feeding tube leads directly to this room. The feeding tube leads to you. As American taxpayers, you are really the only thing keeping this project going. You're the only thing preserving the status quo, and it's the status quo which has enabled everything that has occurred and been reported on the pages of my book, facts which no one has been able to deny. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? Are you going to continue to support the status quo beneath dialogue, or are you going to get in the way? And that's the question I'll leave you with. Thank you. Q&A? Yeah. Any questions?
Yes.
Really fascinating, and I don't think I disagree with you. I'm sort of curious, skepticism of the two-state solution, and you talk about this rise, this conservatism in Israel. I think I also like the idea of sort of a continuity since '48. So what is, if you were whatever, this is the way this could be solved. You talk about what we can do here, but I mean, what is it? One-state solution? I mean, hopefully Jewish people in Israel will reconsider their crappy ideas. I mean, where can we go to have a just solution for the Palestinians?
Well, right now, all we can talk about is tactics and critiques, because we have very little ability to influence a situation that is influenced by elites and very plutocrats who paid off our elected officials. Look at Michael Grimm. Why was he threatening to throw this guy over a balcony? Why was he threatening to chop him in half? It's because of a fundraising scandal. And the scandal goes straight to Rabbi Pinto, who has also bought off the Israeli police forces, the Israeli army, and controls the Shas party in Israel. And the top 5 donors of Eric Cantor are connected to Rabbi Pinto. So you just scratch the surface, and the Israel lobby is everywhere. So where does that leave us? We have a tactic called BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction, which is starting to make inroads in the mainstream, is starting to make an impact, will make an impact on the ground. The peace process hasn't removed a single established settlement unit since the Madrid talks. BDS actually has. It forced Lev Levayev to at least momentarily pull out of the West Bank, who is this diamond merchant, because it targeted his celebrities who were endorsing his merchandise. So, we can talk about tactics, but as far as solutions, I think we need to look at the options that Israel has if the two-state solution is exposed as a farce. It has the option of declaring a single apartheid state, which is the current reality. It has the option of unilaterally withdrawing from the West Bank, which could potentially be worse a worse situation than now because they unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, and look at what Gaza has been transformed into. Israeli administrators actually count the calories of each resident in the Gaza Strip and what they're entitled to each day. So it just means settler colonialism from the outside through this really, high-tech apparatus. And then the third option is that Israel becomes an international pariah and faces massive external pressure to give up its system of apartheid and settler colonialism. And there is then a real peace process. There will be a peace process. A real peace process in which the end of apartheid is negotiated. Nelson Mandela, from his prison cell, said, I'm not going to sit down with this apartheid government until we negotiate the end of apartheid. I'm not going to negotiate over something else. I'm not going to be Mahmoud Abbas. And so, the president of Botswana was the Mahmoud Abbas of his time, and the head of this Bantustan, and the only country that recognized him was Israel, outside of South Africa. So those are the three options, and I'm going with the third option. Here's a tactic that will produce massive external pressure to remove Israel of this horrible system, to remove Israeli Jews of the total societal obligation to control and dominate an indigenous population, and that will legitimize and normalize their presence in the Middle East and allow them to be indigenized. I have a lot of Jewish Israeli friends who are leveling their bodies against the occupation, who are paying a price for refusing army service. And I say, well, why don't you just fucking leave? Just go. And they say, because I don't know anything else. This is my place. I don't speak English that well. I speak Hebrew, and I'm taking Arabic lessons, and I want to be part of this region. And I think they should be given that chance. And I think BDS does give them that chance, and it's actually a call to an appeal to the humanity of Israelis, asking them to give up this system. So that's where I think things should go, and I don't know how things will turn out. History kind of will determine that. But here's a tactic that you can participate in. I say, use it.
Yep.
Yeah, I'm wondering, are you getting any reviews or any invitations to other kinds of venues? I mean, this is great, but it's no fun. I'd like to see you at 92nd Street Wire. And are you getting reviews from any of the mainstream press? Are you going to be on Charlie Rose?
Well, the 92nd Street Wire follows me on Twitter. No, they know I exist. They know the book is out there, and I actually think that many of the people who attacked my book, including John Podhoretz, who declared it the year's most disgusting book, had not even opened it because they couldn't bear to face up with the facts inside the book, because they would be looking at the Moloch in the mirror. They'd be staring into the abyss that they had become. And so they're only able to condemn the titles of my chapters. They dare read a single chapter. I dare them to read the chapter called The Night of Broken Glass and just look in the mirror and see how they've defended this project. And so they've deliberately ignored it, both publicly and privately. But our interest, my interest at least, isn't in impacting the opinions of neoconservatives. I have no interest in doing anything but antagonizing them. My interest is in impacting the views of Jewish American liberals, and places like The Nation magazine. And things are changing there. You can look at the polls, the Gallup polls of grassroots Democrats and their opinions on this issue, and they're changing. They're not sympathetic to Israel anymore. Just look at the 2012 Democratic National Convention and the voice vote on Jerusalem as the undivided capital of Israel and the Jewish people, in which the nays had it, and Antonio Villaraigosa, this bought-off neoliberal mayor of Los Angeles, who had issued a press conference in support of Operation Cast Lead in 2009, as if a mayor of LA has anything to do with that, banged the gavel and said that the ayes have it. So that there's something happening in the Democratic Party and among liberals on this issue, and it's going to come to the surface, and my interest is there. And so I was invited to speak at the New America Foundation, which is headed by Anne-Marie Slaughter, who I'm sure most of you disagree with. She's a liberal interventionist. Peter Bergen, who is a terror expert. I'm not really into this whole idea of terror experts, but he was very brave and stood with me in hosting me. And neoconservatives came down so hard on the New America Foundation in Washington and attempted to get my talk canceled. In one quarter of my talks, there have been attempts to cancel the talk before it even happened. And the New America Foundation refused to buckle, and I think that they were extremely upset at this attempt to suppress the discussion. And it compelled Jim Fallows, who is the editor-in-chief of the Atlantic magazine, to come to the talk and to approach my talk and the book with curiosity and with objectivity. He wanted to know what was in it, what made them so mad. And he looked at the book and he listened to the talk and he came back with a review in the Atlantic. Probably this is the most mainstream review I got. And he wound up comparing the book to The Grapes of Wrath and to Bury My Heart, It Wounded Me. And he said, if this book is anti-Israel, then The Wire is anti-American. It was really a rousing defense of the book, at least as a legitimate critique of what Israel had become. And he also said, why does Max have to like these right-wingers? He admits that he doesn't like them, but he admitted that he didn't like the Christian right in his first book, Republican Gomorrah, and nobody had any problem with that. And I would just add, Terry Gross hosted me to talk about Republican Gomorrah on NPR, and within 5 minutes the book was a bestseller, but she has refused, they've rejected having me on. Like, they told my publishers we won't have him on. So I'm trying to push on the progressive side, and I think there is a shift there. And I think we are making inroads. There is more political space than people think, and I found that on my book tour.
Right. Yeah. Could you address the tail and the dog analogy? There's I think a pretty general consensus that you hear a lot that American foreign policy is made in Israel. And I think this is a fairly common assumption among people who are anti-Zionist. And I think it's a totally backward analysis that does not at all understand the nature of imperialism. And I think that what you said is actually the heart of the matter, is that the path to a solution in Israel-Palestine is right here in the United States, because without American support, there would be no Israel, at least in its current configuration. And the reason there's an Israel is because it serves the geopolitical interests of America and Europe and the Middle East. At least that's my opinion. I'd like to hear your comment on it.
I don't agree with your opinion. I don't agree with the opinion of Norman Finkelstein or Noam Chomsky that Israel's an outpost of American imperialism, because it doesn't serve American empire very well. That's why we see David Petraeus, Stephen Wall, John Mearsheimer, these establishment figures, these realists constantly condemning the Israel lobby and warning about its danger. George Ball, his book, The Passionate Attachment, was also expressed with concern for American empire and the damage that Israel was doing to it. Going back to Truman and before, to Roosevelt, the Arabists in the State Department warned that the foundation of a Jewish state would damage American imperial designs. It's very rare that we see Israel actually acting on America's behalf to advance American empire. And the ultimate, I think, example of this is just look at Barack Obama's State of the Union last night, where he said that he would veto AIPAC's legislation to AIPAC's new sanctions legislation, which is, Congress is going to sign on to. So is Barack Obama suddenly a Kenyan anti-colonialist for real? Like, I don't think so. He is as much of an imperialist as George W. Bush or any other American president. He sees rapprochement with Iran as beneficial to American empire, especially at the current juncture of American decline. So I do think that the Israel lobby is the main defining factor in America's relationship with Israel, but it doesn't mean that the Israel lobby is acting completely on Israel's behalf, although AIPAC has a duty to be the voice of Netanyahu. The Israel lobby is also a part of Jewish life in America, as Zionism has sort of captured Jewish life. It's very unfortunate, but for many secular American Jews, especially of the older generation, Israel is the central pillar of their identity. One easy way to be Jewish is to support Israel. Send money to the Jewish National Fund. Send money to the Israeli government. Friends of the IDF, supported by Haim Saban, to the tune of like $13 million a year. Haim Saban was also one of the largest donors to Barack Obama, and his wife Cheryl got a special appointment at the UN. So there is just, the Israel lobby is incredibly powerful, and it's deciding how Congress is acting on this issue. Our members of Congress have very little to gain by listening to us, and a lot to lose, a lot of money to lose. This is very controversial to say, but Ron Kempeus, who is the Washington bureau chief of the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, wrote that 1/3 to 2/3 of individual donations to the Democratic Party are from Jews. Now, many of them may not be interested in Israel, but many of them are, and if you consider that Sheldon Adelson is the largest single donor in American political history, and is also Benjamin Netanyahu's largest financier. You have to consider that this is an issue of lobbying and of a passionate attachment, and not as much about American empire. And I dislike American imperialism as much as you, for the record.
In the back.
Hi, Max, longtime reader, big fan of yours. If the Israeli state, if the ethnic state of Israel just pulled the plug tomorrow, would you clap? Would you support that? Would you say?
I'm an open opponent of the existence of a Jewish exclusivist state, and I would just as those who supported the boycott of apartheid South Africa popped champagne when de Klerk declared the end of apartheid in South Africa, I would do the same.
What do you think would happen in a year after something like that?
That's a good question. We can look at South Africa as an example and look at Eugene Terreblanche's terror squads in the attempt to resurrect apartheid in South Africa, and this failed, and I think there will be an attempt to resurrect apartheid in Israel through the settlement movement and elements like that, if it comes to an end, but it's such a hypothetical scenario, I can't even predict it. What I do know is that all of the defenders of apartheid in South Africa in the United States are ashamed of what they stood for and are afraid to admit or discuss it, or at least most of them are. And I think it'll be the same. Me and Phil Weiss, who's the editor of Mondo Weiss, had this kind of running joke about all the books that'll be published in the future by liberal Zionists, and how they will basically publish books that were previously published by anti-Zionists, like The Invention of the Jewish People or The Israel Lobby will be written by Peter Beinart, and they'll adopt the critique that was way ahead of the curve once the reality of the end of a Jewish state becomes inevitable. And I don't know if that will take 10 or 50 years, but the only question to ask is the question that David Petraeus asked Paula Broadwell, which is, how will this all end? Another doomed project.
Any more questions? Yes.
You mentioned about Kerry having negotiations.
Buy my book on the way out.
Oh yes, the book is the same.
About Kerry having negotiations right now with some of these bad political leaders in Israel. Under what auspices? I mean, I know the State Department part is the Vice President, all that, but if the UN is not involved at all, which it doesn't sound like it is he doing this completely only on behalf of of Barack Obama? I don't quite get what.
Well, I mean, he hasn't, I don't know if what the participation of NATO or the EU is, but it's really Kerry's mission to create a framework for a framework, which means it's like a proposal for a potential deal because he can't get any final status agreement. And I think it's tactical. The US has no diplomatic program beyond 2 states, so they have to keep the peace process going. So they're setting up a new basis based on the new facts on the ground, which have completely shifted in Israel's favor, to replace the Clinton parameters. And they'll be reintroduced during the next administration, which they expect to be run by Hillary Clinton, because of the demographic, the demographic threat in the U.S. has shifted, the electoral situation out of Republican hands, which is, explains their shared values with Israel. They really expect to start the peace process again in 2017, and Avigdor Lieberman revealed the whole sham at the Saban Center recently in Washington, when he said we need to have a peace process because it helps us maintain the conflict or manage the conflict. In other words, the longer, if we can keep the Palestinian Authority locked into some timetable and keep the talks going on, we can keep putting new facts on the ground, and there's nothing they or the international community can do to hold us accountable, and it seems like we're sincere about making peace. So the peace process and the framework agreement is actually kind of an Israeli tactic that needs to be exposed. And I think, by the way, if you're going to buy my book, Rashid Khalidi wrote an excellent book, Brokers of Deceit. This isn't from an insider's perspective. Never got reviewed in The Nation. Almost got very few reviews, but I think it exposes the peace process brilliantly since the Madrid process. All right, so I'll sign books, and thanks again for coming in the cold.